am joined by McBanterface, one of the best Hearthstone players in North America. Hearthstone Grandmaster, guy named after Bodie McBoatface, and I have it on good authority that it is a highly competitive region, North America, that it's a very incredible accomplishment to be one of the best players in North American Hearthstone. I have it on very good authority that that is true. McBanterface, you have played Marvel Snap before, correct?
I have, yes. I did play for quite a bit at kind of the start of the game. I have not played for around probably 6 or 7 months now. The last card that I remember seeing was High Evo. So that is the
Okay.
extent of my knowledge.
Which is good because we have a collection of cards for you. All of them are going to be cards that you do not remember, but if you do remember them, they're going to be different. So they're like in two groups today. Cards that came out after High Evo that you have no idea about, that you're going to have to evaluate whether they're good or not, completely blind. And cards that were around when High Evo first came out, but by extension have been changed in some way or another. And I'm going to need you to tell me if they're still good. Now, let's get into the first card since I don't have to explain the rules of Marvel Snap to you. I will, just in case people are watching. The rules of Marvel Snap are there are 3 different locations. You win the game by having the most points on 2 of those 3 locations. Cards have costs and point values. So you see the Jean Grey over here, it costs 3, and it gives you 3 points on the location that you play it at. It also has a decent amount of, other impact thanks to its effect. Cards will have effects. It's pretty simple. You get 1 energy every turn, and the game automatically ends on turn 6. For you Hearthstone players, yes, energy is mana. It works exactly the same. You get 1 every turn, and then whoever has the most points on 2 out of 3 locations on turn 6 is going to win the game. With that said, McBanterface, we're dropping you a bit in the deep end because this is a card that I think a lot of people find difficult to evaluate. So this is Jean Grey, 3/3, cost 3, 3 power. Ongoing, players must play their first card here each turn.
Okay. So, I mean, the first thing that kind of my brain always goes to when I'm looking at cards, just because I am a Hearthstone player, is like, the stat line or whatever, which 3 mana or 3 energy, 3/3. That's the first thing I look at, and I think, okay, that seems a little below the power curve in terms of just raw stats. So I would assume, kind of given that it's got to have a good effect. Now, it is I mean, that definitely feels like an effect that is very different from anything that I ever saw. Uh, I would imagine that there are some ways to kind of like build your deck in a way where it's easy to get around it. Where if you have like some cheaper cards, then you can sort of like have maybe a location that you are ready to give up. And maybe you try to like split into the other locations by just being able to play more things. Now, I feel like the part where it gets kind of weird for me is because there's only 4 spots on each location, like, I guess it gets filled kind of fast. But if it's only the first, I guess it only comes down on turn 3. I mean, I feel like this has got to be kind of strong just because the effect is so like for the first card you turn. I feel like a lot of decks, at least back when I played, were only playing like 1 card per turn. So if you're playing against a deck that kind of does that, and you force them to put a lot of power into one lane, then I feel like maybe you can build it in a way where you can like stack on the other lanes. So my verdict is going to be that I think this card would be really strong with the right deck built around it.
All right, I'm gonna get the Jean Grey truthers mad at me, but no, that is not that is not correct. It's like I get where you're coming from logically. You look at it and you're like, all right, there's no way they would release this card and have it not be good, right? Wrong.
Mhm.
They did that. They did release this card and have it not be good. So the thing with Jean Grey is like she's not unplayable, She's often like a reasonable-ish card in certain decks that are looking to do the thing you're talking about. It's just those decks have rarely been very good, right? So like you can play her in like your Guardians of the Galaxy, Alioth, whatever lockdown deck. You want to do stuff like that. You don't know what those words mean, but like
I don't.
you can play her in decks that are trying to do the things that you're talking about here, but that kind of deck might not be the best version of that strategy because you are investing in something like Jean Grey, right? Like she's fine. I don't think she's like wildly unplayable, but it is very far off from this card being actively good. I had, when this card came out, I had a friend who is a pro Magic player who plays a decent amount of Snap. He messaged me. He was like, why is this card symmetrical? Why can't it just say your opponent? Is there a good reason for that? And I think if it did just say your opponent, your evaluation would be like much closer to correct, but it makes you do it too, and it's like very, very awkward because of that. If it said your opponent, it would be able to do the things that you talked about. Unfortunately, Jean Grey's wording is not that.
Right. All right. We're off to a good start.
Doing great. I just wanted to shout out the two people in the chat that I noticed like right after each other. The first one was like, I'm so glad you do these live. It's such good content. And the second one was like, oh my god, do you even play Marvel Snap anymore? You're just recording YouTube videos on stream. The duality of man. It's a really... I was so sick to see like one after the other. All right, next up, Spider Ham. 1 cost, 1 power. On reveal, transform the leftmost card into your opponent's hand into a pig, keeping its power and cost. Now, leftmost tends to be the cards that sit in their hand. So like leftmost is the one that is the technically the oldest card in their hand, depending on if they played the first card they drew off.
Right.
So.
Okay. Well, so it's super cheap, which for me, like cheaper cards tend to just be better. I don't really know how well that, excuse me, how well that translates into Snap, but in general, like the flexibility of cheap cards is something that I feel like is usually going to be good across various card games. So the effect is like, I mean, so like in Hearthstone, for example, it kind of reminds me of like different like transform effects. There's not a ton of it, but it's just a sort of like basic disruption. But I feel like this seems really cheap. Like obviously it is only 1 power, but I would think that a lot of decks, like I know there was like Odin, which was the like a 6 mana card, on reveal or whatever, and like that's your turn 6 play. That's your finisher. So if you play this on turn 5, like if you need to fill in your mana, or I mean, even if you just like maybe even if you play it on 1, it might be a little more questionable. But I feel like a lot of cards are on reveal, and if you transform into a pig, I'm assuming that means it has no card text, right?
Correct. It has absolutely no card text. It turns
Yeah.
into this thing, and it gets the power and cost, but it gets no text.
Right. I mean, I feel like that's basically deleting a card from their hand. I mean, I guess sometimes like with I remember like Infinite, that would be a really bad thing. So maybe there are some significant downsides to it in that sense. But I have to imagine that there's way more super powerful on reveal cards that you just want to play. And if you just make it cost and power, it's going to be like a 6 mana, 6 power thing or whatever. So I think this one for sure has got to be good. I think I'm gonna say it's really good.
So I think your analysis is more or less on point here, which is to say, this card was actually insanely good. It used to target just straight up the highest cost card in your opponent's hand, and it was just like an absolute, like it was hitting that Odin every time. Right. Now, since it's only hitting the leftmost, it's seen a lot less play, right? So like this came out and it was like, oh my god, it is absolutely everywhere. It is shutting things down, like Living Tribunal or whatever. You probably don't know that card, but like it's like the top end of like a combo deck, basically. And it would just get turned into a pig and the deck would fall apart, right? And that is a common thing that this card would do. As a leftmost card, though, I've only really found use for it in extremely specific cases. Like the last time I played this was when I was playing a deck that does not like seeing mirrors because of a specific top end card. And so you'd just be playing it to get rid of that specific top end card. As a cheap card, I think there are usually better options. I would say this sort of falls into like the tech area for me, where it's like, this is a card where if you have a really good idea of what you want to hit with it, you can definitely be playing it. I have played it a fair amount this season. But if you don't have a really good idea of what you want to hit with it, if you're not specifically trying to disrupt something that you have a bad matchup with, it's a little bit not like a generic just auto include.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds similar to more like the Hearthstone transform effects. They're always just like tech cards, so that makes
Yeah,
sense.
it's a little like, yeah, it's like Hex, right? Where it's like you don't always run this because it's like, okay, you could probably do better most of the time, but if you have something you need to run it for, then it makes a lot more sense. Next up, we have Jeff, the baby land shark. 2/3. You can move this once. Nothing can stop you from moving or playing this to any location.
Hmm. Okay. So two mana or two energy, three
Yeah.
power is already solid, I
Hmm.
feel like, just in terms of the stats. And then I mean being able to move it. So I know there was a Nightcrawler was like sort of the original card that I played with where you could
Yeah.
move it around. And that card was very good at one power or one energy. I think it was two power.
Yeah, Nightcrawler was a 1/2. I
One,
will
two.
say, I don't think Nightcrawler was very good outside of the context of the new player experience, but yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So, I mean, being able to move it once seems, I mean, there's like situations, right, where you need to add a little power to a certain location. Um, I feel like the really interesting part is that nothing can stop you from moving or playing to any location because I know that there's a handful of like lockdown effects or, like there's like the Spider-Man and like Professor X that would just lock you down. And I feel like if you have this and maybe somebody thinks that they won a lane because they have like, Professor X and you have nothing in there and you can kind of just sneak it in there. Um, I feel like that's a pretty interesting mechanic. And the power is good. I feel like I'm second guessing myself because I keep thinking that all these cards are good and apparently they're not. But I do think the effect is quite strong. I guess it's just sort of like it probably doesn't really add to that many strategies in terms of deck building. It's more kind of just like maybe like a flex card, or I wouldn't really call it a tech card, but sort of just like a flexible card that you throw in. So I think that this would be pretty good, but maybe not like meta defining or whatever. But I think it seems pretty good.
You talked yourself out of this one, where this is actually like just sort of the default 2-cost card that every deck plays. Like if you don't know what you're doing in your 2-drop slot, you just put this guy in there. Like he's just like that much good enough. Because it's not just like, okay, you have your Professor X's or whatever, right? It's not just that. It's also like, okay, a Sanctum Sanctorum flipped up. Guess I win that. A Death's Domain flipped up. Guess I win that. Like just locations where people can't play, you just instantly kind of win them there. And so you end up in this awkward spot where like, okay, you got this Jeff, and now my Jeff just like free wins games. Even in decks where he's not like insanely optimal, if you just like have an extra slot, you put the Jeff in there and you're just like, oh, okay, that's nice. That's very, very good. And so I think right now we're actually at like the spot where he's like the worst, or he's the worst he's been in a while, and he's still probably the most played card in the game. It's
Oh wow. Most played
he is
card, not just
a,
two cost?
I believe last time I checked, which was like a couple weeks ago, Jeff was played in almost 49% of decks after Infinite.
Wow.
So a big number.
Yeah, that's
There's a
crazy.
lot of Jeff.
That's a huge
That said, it's a huge proportion, yes. So you mentioned Spider-Man in that last answer. I wasn't going to go to these until a little bit later, but I'm going to them now because you mentioned Spider-Man, because he's not the same as he used to be. They
Yeah.
realized that everyone hated that card, and that having everyone hate Spider-Man sort of turns the whole player base into J. Jonah Jameson, and that's not really how they wanted to do things. So Spider-Man got reworked into his current form. Now he's a 3/5, on reveal, move to a different location, and pull an enemy card there.
Okay, so it's pulling from the location that you originally place him at?
Correct.
Okay, interesting. So decent like stat line for its cost, right? I mean, immediately the thing that kind of sketches me out a little bit about it is the fact that you move to wait, it's a random location, right? You don't get
Yes.
that. Okay.
Actually, there is a rule to it, right? Like if a location is like he prioritizes specific locations. I think there's like something specific, something weird about him that I'm remembering, just like half remembered here. I'm sure chat will be able to fill me in. But like Spider-Man prioritizes, like obviously he can't move to a location that's full, but I
Right.
feel like there's something else that he does priority wise. I'm not actually 100% sure. I feel like what he's supposed to do is move to locations where he prioritizes. Okay, yeah, no. What he prioritizes is moving both your opponent's cards and himself. So if you have a full location, he can't move there. But if they have a full location, he also won't move there. He will try
Oh,
to
okay.
move to a spot where he can do his full effect.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. All right. So, but I mean, I would assume that a lot of the time it's getting played, there's not necessarily full locations anyway. So then in a lot of cases, it's going to be sort of like a coin flip between which one you go to. Um, so I guess like the idea would be that you're trying to, like drag out a certain amount of power from a location. Maybe you want to do it on like turn 6 or whatever, but then you kind of might run into an issue where one of the locations is full. So I mean, it seems very like inconsistent to me. I would think that maybe in like a movement deck or something where you have synergy with moving around, I could see it being good. But otherwise, it feels kind of just like maybe a bit too random. The stat line does seem pretty solid, but I'm for the first time, I'm gonna say I don't think that this card is great.
This card has been great in the past in this form, where it is like this in that movement deck you mentioned. There was a movement deck that would use like this card and Craven and some other stuff and just play stuff that was fundamentally overstated, right? You're already getting good value from the 3/5. You're getting extra value off your Craven turning into like a 2/8 or whatever. But multiple cards out of that deck have been nerfed. Spider-Man is just one that hasn't. Right now, Spider-Man, if he does see play, tends to see play in Silver Surfer type strategies where just having a good body and some disruption to go alongside your 3-cost synergy is just a very, very good and reasonable thing to do. Like Spider-Man, I think you're underrating a little bit in terms of how disruptive his effect can be. He tends to just be good at a bare minimum. It's just that like certain decks, like those move-based decks, are being punished by other cards in the current metagame, and so they're not as viable as they used to be. That said, I think I would describe Spider-Man as a pretty good card. I think he is a solid piece of disruption. He is played in decks that you're not going to believe this actually. He is played in decks not just Silver Surfer that key off of his cost, but he's played in a deck Cerebro 5 that keys off of his power. And yes, people actually play Cerebro 5. It's not very like amazing, but as far as Cerebro decks go, it's one of the best they've ever had.
Right.
And Spider-Man being 5 for 3 is actually like a pretty decent part of that. Like Spider-Man just being like a little bit of a disruptive piece with a good stat line that you can later add stats to. That tends to be his role in almost all of these decks. And that I think the disruption tends to actually be pretty valuable when you consider that you're getting it on an above rate body to begin with.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the body does seem very nice. I was just thinking the disruption was maybe not that useful, but all right, makes sense.
It's like the like floor of useful, right? Like this is about as low as you can go on disruption and have it still be like, okay, I'm happy this happened. Like
Sure.
it's not always going to be the best card you can play, but like yeah, it's been around. This is Gladiator. 3/7 He's got an almost 30 rat effect, except he pulls from the deck instead. Add a card from your opponent's deck to their side of the location that he's played on. If it has less power, that card dies.
Okay. Well, okay. My immediate thought is that this card is trash. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind. And my thinking is this activates the on reveal effect of their card, right?
Correct.
Regardless. Right. I feel like that's got to be a massive downside. Like for this to be good, I mean, okay, so it has a good stat line, right? Very good stat line. 7 power is a lot for 3, I think. Uh so like it's sort of like a stat bomb, but I have to imagine there's a lot of game losing cards to hit. Not to mention if you hit something with less power, you probably just like instantly lose because it has a good on
No, 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 no,
reveal.
no, no, no. The thing with less power
Oh, sorry.
dies.
Sorry, I meant with more power. Sorry. I
Oh,
meant
yes.
if you pull something that's like 8 power or 7 power, and then it just sticks on the board, I feel like you probably lose at that point because it might have an on reveal ability. I feel like most I don't know like the percentage, but I feel like most cards have abilities. So I'm gonna say confidently this time that this card is trash.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Like there are some like edge cases where you can play him where it's like, okay, I took a really good shell and then put this guy into it and it's still like a good deck and it's like, yeah, okay, that totally makes sense. But there are very few cases where you can play this guy and you can say like confidently that he is better than say Polaris or like whatever other 3 cost big stat thing you'd replace him with. Like there are very few situations where I feel confident at least playing this guy and being like, yeah, I'm 100% sure this is the best card for the slot, right? This is just the best thing you could be doing. It's basically never true. That said, I mean, he has seen some minimal play, although I think a lot of that was just based on novelty because he's a newer card rather than anything specific. I think your rating is pretty close to the truth, but I will say he's not like unmitigated trash. 3-7 is still like an amazing stat line. Like you can do things with him, you can play him. It's just very rare for me to look at him and be like, yeah, that's the best thing you can do with your 3 cost slot. Like that's what you should be doing all the time.
All right. Fair enough. I'll count that one as a W, my first one.
I mean, I think there's no way that might actually be your first W.
I think it is.
All right, this is Werewolf by Night. 3/3. After you play an on reveal card at another location, move there, gain 2 power.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, that effect seems very strong to me just because like again, like you play it in a movement deck, right? And I think a decent amount of from what I remember for whatever the movement deck was back when I played, I think there were a decent amount of on reveals. And I mean, for this, like we just talked about, I mean, 7 power is like it's a massive stat line for, for 3 mana. And so if this moves twice, if you play an on reveal on 4 and 5 or 4 and 6, whatever, even twice, that seems good. And then there's probably movement synergy as well. I feel like you could probably play this card in a deck that's not even movement related at all, just because I feel like there's so many on reveals. I think you would only need to play 2 for you to be pretty happy with this card. Maybe like the location space gets a bit weird because there are only 4, so you have to be somewhat limited in how many cards you can play in each place, but it can also move multiple times in a turn, right? Like you'd play
Correct.
yeah. I mean, I feel like this has gotta be really good. I feel like you probably get it to 9 power, maybe semi consistently. So I think this card is very good.
Uh yeah. 100% correct. Except instead of getting to 9 semi consistently, you get it to like 13 or something. Like it is this is the probably the best stat stick in Marvel Snap right now. You mentioned everything about it, right? Like, first of all, you're like, okay, we put it in a move deck. Maybe there's move synergy, and then you're like, no, you don't even need a move deck. Correct. Most of the decks that play this card are just playing it as a big guy, right? This is your big guy stat stick. He bounces around and he gets very, very big, and that's the thing that he does. And in order to alleviate the movement space, most decks that build around him play cards that send cards back to your hand, so you can repeat their on reveals and get him even bigger and bigger and bigger. I've seen this guy get up to like 20 just as a 3-cost card. It's a very, very, very large guy. And I think the main thing that I like about your analysis is that you were focused on the downside. You're like, yeah, even if you only put like 3 on reveals, it's like a 3/9, you're very happy with it. And that is true. You are just basically always happy with it. You're super into it. This card is extremely powerful, and that's another dub on the board. This is Loki, 4-cost 5 power. On reveal, replace your hand with cards from your opponent's deck. Give them -1 cost.
Okay. So first of all, it's a weird effect. I mean,
Yes.
like super weird. You deleting your entire hand. Now,
Mhm.
the thing that I know about, I mean, just card games in general, is that mana cheat tends to be very strong. Um, okay, so you replace your hand, so I guess you change however many cards you have, and it's their starting deck, so you can get stuff that they've already played or whatever.
Yep.
Uh, huh. I mean, the -1 cost thing immediately, I think like that's got to be strong. The only thing that gets me a little hung up is it. You play this on turn 4, so you only have 2 turns unless you like prolong the game. I know there's location that makes it go to turn 7. Maybe you like play it in a deck with the card that makes it go to turn 7. I don't know. It seems maybe a little far fetched, but maybe you don't have that much time to utilize it. I guess could be the only thing that feels a bit weird. I feel like this one's really hard to evaluate because your opponent is going to be playing a good deck, presumably. Uh, so you would assume that the cards in their deck are good, and maybe again going back to the on reveal thing, like if a lot of cards have on reveal effects, then giving them -1 cost sounds powerful. It's just like I don't know what deck you put it in, like what the plan is on turns 5 and 6. Um, but it is sort of like mana cheat. I mean, there's mana cheat in the card, and because there's on reveal stuff, I'm gonna say there's. I don't know how you build around it, but I feel like there's got to be a deck for this. With some way to do it. Maybe you can add cards to your hand and keep your hand size high, and then replace it all on turn 4, and just like put down a bunch of stats on 5 and 6. I'm gonna say that in the right deck, I think this would be very good. Yeah.
Exactly correct. I'm glad you got there. You actually like you built the deck, right? Like you built the deck as this is a card I love to give to Hearthstone players because they know 2 things. 1, mana cheat is really good, and 2, Burgle Rogue almost always sucks. And so like this is a card I like to give to Hearthstone players because it's like, all right, are you gonna guess the correct thing, which is that this card is completely insane because of the mana cheat? Or are you going to be like, nah, it's Burgle Rogue, it's fine, who cares, right? And you got to it, right? Like you play this in a deck where you fill your hand up, and then you play this on turn 4, and then you immediately go completely berserk because you play the rest of their deck, the key turns, but cheaper and better. And so you end up just like absolutely power spiking off of this guy. There's other
Mhm.
synergies there too. I don't want to give them away in case they end up coming up later. I don't know if they will. But basically like this is a guy that is one of the, if not the best build arounds for any deck in the game. Like he is his own archetype. When he came out, he was his own archetype almost immediately, and he is extremely, extremely powerful. Also, just a note, he has been nerfed. He's still very good. He used to cost 3, which is a little bit even funnier. Same stat line too, just a 3/5.
It was a 3/5.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that sounds crazy. Like
For like
just
2
that
months, it
extra.
was a 3/5.
Wow.
They just let that happen. It was sick.
Yeah, that sounds actually bonkers. That's
That was
that's too much mana for too many
very
turns.
cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very cool. It was very cool. Here is Kitty Pryde, 1/0. When this returns to your hand, +1 power, and it returns at the start of each turn.
Okay, so it's a card that bounces. So if you play it on turn 1, obviously, I mean, that is a lot of stats for 1 mana.
Yep.
I guess you have to, I mean, you have to play it on turn 6. So you have to invest that like 1 energy on that turn, which maybe could be annoying. But so wait, so it becomes a 1/5 at the end then? Or because you only bounce it 5 times, right?
Correct.
So yeah, it would be a 1/5. Okay. Well, 1/5 is a lot for sure. Now, I guess where it gets kind of weird is like obviously it gets worse and worse as the game goes on. If you draw this on like turn 3 already, it's like, is that even worth playing? I feel like a lot of the time it probably wouldn't be. I don't really know much about like bounce synergy, about if there's maybe stuff that gets buffed on board because of this like returning to your hand. But I mean, it does feel like only like the best case scenario is kind of good where you do it on like turns 1 or 2. I think as soon as you hit like turn 3, if you draw this, it's just kind of like whatever because you have, yeah, no, you have to invest like way too much power into it if you do it on turn 3. Wait, okay, I'm thinking more about it. Now it looks kind of terrible. Because you have to spend the power every turn. So you have to have some like crazy synergy for this to be good, right? Otherwise, it seems super useless to me. So I'm gonna say that this is bad. Maybe there's some like niche case where there's like a bounce deck, but I think this just seems bad. It seems too expensive.
So I'm gonna walk you through the history of this card because I think this might be the most changed card in the entirety of Marvel Snap. Which is to say, she has been busted at every other stat line and ability that she's had, except this one right now. So this before I want to say 2 months ago, she was a 1/2 with this ability. And then before that, she was, I want to say, a 1/0, but she got +2 every time she bounced. And then before that, she was that, except you controlled the bouncing and when it happened. So you could just either leave her there or not and take her back to your hand if you wanted. The downside of that one was it would crash the game. So they got rid of her for like 2 months, and they were like, "Oh my god, we have to like completely fix this card," because like she would crash the game sometimes when you put her back into your hand, and they couldn't figure out exactly why. So they just got rid of her ability to ever be put back into your hand. They just made it happen automatically, and they gave her to everyone for free. And so then her next iteration with the +2, where she got +2 every time she bounced, was extremely powerful. And so then they made her a 1/2 that got +1 every time she bounced, and you would like use her in some pretty strong stuff. And then when a card was coming out that they worried would push that version over the top, they made her a 1/0, and she was extremely strong with that card, even as a 1/0. But then they nerfed that card, and now she's in her current state, and she's actually kind of talking about, like, okay, do we need to, like, revert this nerf? Can we make her good again? But, like, her ability is so ripe for just abuse, like with anything that triggers off of cards coming down. Like, you remember the card Angela, right? Like, this is a card that would go with that, right? You get a bunch of stats on it, right? Like Bishop, things like that. Like, it's just like her ability is so ripe for being extremely powerful in specific circumstances that I feel like they're very, very cautious with her, which sucks because she's one of my favorite cards in the game. I like taking game actions. And right now, I think this is the first time she's actually been like, all right, this card is actually bad. Like, it's the first time it's been bad.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the like original versions you're talking about sound really strong. Like
They were.
1, 2. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that sounds crazy. Yeah.
They were extremely
Wow.
strong. Like, she had a ton of really broken interactions in her first version, which was out for 2 days before they realized it was crashing the game. And then the 1+2 was just like, oh my god, this is like a 112. Like, what are we doing here? Like, it's just like
Yeah.
the biggest thing ever. And also, my Angela and Bishop are growing. It's very, like, she's been the keystone to metas before. Next up is Martyr, 1/4. But at the end of the game, she moves to a location that loses you the game.
Okay, that's hilarious card text.
It's very funny card text.
So what? Okay, so like if if this card is in a location that you're winning, so you're winning 2 locations and you have this in, let's say, the middle location, can just move to, like, the location you're already winning. It loses you the game, like, it loses the game,
Yes.
not the
Yeah,
location.
so like if you have her in a location and you're counting on her staying there, she will not stay there. Like
I mean,
that is
there's no way you could possibly convince me that this card is good. I feel like, the only way I could possibly see it being good is if some like, I guess, like a zoo deck where you actually fill every single location slot. Maybe then I could see it because then it can't move. But even then, maybe it gets a bit weird if they like destroy one of your cards. But I guess that application, if that is a deck, I know that was a thing when I first started playing. It was kind of like a low rank deck or whatever. It's easy to play. But I feel like those types of decks wouldn't be that strong nowadays. So I'm gonna say maybe in that deck it's okay, but like everywhere else, this must be bad.
I had to spend that entire time like trying not to laugh too loudly and give the game away. Yeah, she sucks. She's
Okay, yeah.
terrible. It's just a very bad card. I do think there's like a world in which like people are overstating how bad she is. Like, yeah, she's still a 1/4. There's like some like you can Professor X the lane that she's in, and that's actually kind of cool, right? Like, there's like there's like she's not like awful, unusable, the worst, but she's just like a card where it's like, okay, this is not worth getting. I'll tell you, I got this card specifically so I could show it on these videos. Like, that's the reason I own it. I bought it 20 minutes before I did the one with Trump. Like,
Nice.
that's the whole reason I own this card, is just so I can just see how this goes.
I feel
So
like
far, no one has gotten it wrong. Everyone's like, yeah, that's the worst thing I've ever seen.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like it would make for some fun moments for sure, where like you think that it's doing something good because it's in a location and something gets destroyed and then you lose because of it. But
Yep.
that seems like the extent of where it would be useful.
I also ask this question to most people, like, what stat line would this need to have to be good with that effect?
Uh 8? I mean, it's just like the way I feel like it needs a lot of stuff. Maybe not 8, but I mean, even if it like a 1/5, I don't think I would be convinced that this is playable.
Okay.
1/6 is where it maybe starts to get a little more reasonable, like
Yeah.
specifically for like a zoo deck, but I I wouldn't want to go anywhere near this card, I think.
So 1/6 is the number I keep coming back to, and apparently
Mhm.
they tested that during the like testing process for this card. They were like, all right, what about a 1/6? And it turns out like when she was a 1/6, she just wasn't moving. It's like the 6 would just win you whatever lane anyway. And so her effect just wasn't happening. And the way I think
Right.
about it is that like, yeah, that must be the break point for where she's good, because that's the point at which her text doesn't mean anything, right? And if you want this card to be good, her text can't mean anything. Like, if you
Right.
want her, like, if her effect is ever happening, you're literally losing the game. So you don't ever want it to happen. Like, that's the thing I think about. Like, it's like I don't think people like it's such a weird card, because it's like you want it to never actually happen. And so if you give it a stat line where the effect never happens, what's the point of it having that effect? And so it can't ever be a good card, because they always have to give it a stat line where the effect happens, and when the effect happens, you die. And
Right.
so it's like a very, it's one of the things where like I think about it and it's like, that's a very odd card to get through the design process. I feel like you're right that it's one of the funniest pieces of text in the entire game. Spider-Man 2099. 2099. Everyone's gonna get mad at me because it's actually not 2099. It's just 2099. Whatever. I like saying it like that. 4/6. Now, the first time this card moves to any location, it destroys an enemy card there.
Okay. Well,
Also,
the
I want to
stat
clarify. This is important to clarify. It's not the first time it moves to the location. It's the first time it moves. Like, you can't move it twice and blow up two things. I wanted to be clear on that.
right. Okay. Yeah, yeah, got it. So the stat line is okay. I mean, 4/6 does maybe not too great, but it's like serviceable. Now, I mean, that seems like a really strong effect because I obviously you're going to play this in decks that move things. I don't know why you would ever play it in a deck that doesn't have like a some movement card. I don't really remember much about what sort of movement cards there are, which is kind of I feel like what this hinges on is those cards being strong enough and that deck being strong enough to be able to move your own things. But I have to imagine that if this was printed, there is enough synergy for it to move around your own things. And destroying an enemy card sounds strong. Now, obviously, it could destroy like a one cost card, and the on reveals already happened. But in any case, like worst case scenario, when you're moving, I feel like it's gonna be effectively like worth 8 stats because you're gonna get rid of at least 2 stats, probably on average a lot more, like 5 or 6, because you're doing this in the later turns. So I think that this card would be very good in any sort of movement deck, like maybe even win you the game type of good.
Nah, he's pretty terrible. Uh, he's he's not a good card in any real sense of the word. He's as a movement payoff. There tend to be better and cheaper ones if you are gonna play that deck. Most people don't play that deck, and you're right that this does sort of hinge on how easy it is to move stuff around and how rewarding it is to do that. But like, just blowing up one of 4 cards is not very good when there are things like, you have like Shang-Chi, right? Targeted removal for big stuff, right? Like, you just do other stuff. And I think the fact that this guy leaves it all up to chance means that most of the time he's ever good is like when they only have one big unit in a lane, which very rarely happens. Like, this is not a Namor meta. I don't think there's ever been a Namor meta. And in those situations, he could be theoretically good, but those situations just aren't common enough for you to put him in there and risk like using your entire turn to blow up a 1-drop and like be sad. Because there are very few metas that do not involve like most locations having multiple cards on them, and only one of those cards being the thing you actually want to hit with this guy. You're right that he's a 4/8. It's just a 4/8 isn't winning you the game.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I guess I'm used to when I played, I mean, I was a noob, so I
Yeah,
I mostly played against people who had like one or two like one or two big cards in the location. So I feel
it's
like
a
this
lot more
would be
common
good.
down there. Like, if
Right.
there is a Namor meta, it is early pools, right? Like where like you have like 4 cards in one location, you have like your Dino or your Namor somewhere else, right?
Oh, it was yeah, there was always like a
Yeah,
dino. That's what it was. There was a
yeah.
dino in one location. I was like, "Oh yeah, you just move this to that place and it'd be good."
Yeah, but like the thing is, by the time you are playing this card, you aren't playing against those decks anymore. So like Dino has like some 1-drops next to it, and it's very very sad. But yeah, no, like this is not a good card. It's generally regarded as one of the worst. It's one of the ones though. Weirdly, the devs always say like this guy has like an actual positive win rate in our data. And I don't know exactly what they're cooking. I don't know what ranks they're filtering for, but apparently we're all just missing something.
But maybe I'm right about this and you just haven't seen the light, you know?
Right. Yeah.
That
Maybe
must
you
be
are.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Meet Legion. 5/7. On reveal, replace each other location with this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, weird, first of all.
Weird.
I I mean, that is so strange because like, you can't really plan for locations in certain games, right? Like, it's fully random?
Yeah. I mean, it's they're weighted, but like you can't be like I'm getting X location.
Right. So, I mean, I guess where it could get pretty weird is, like, if there's certain, like, really impactful locations, like, the one where you need to have, like, the least power or something like that, like, you play this on the last turn as some big surprise turn, but it just seems so random that it's like, I don't know how you would build a deck around it because it fully depends on what location. Now, there might be like certain maybe there's certain locations where you can change it with your cards. Like I know Storm was a card like that where in one turn it would become locked. So
I'll
like
let you know that actually you can do that.
you can.
You can do like Storm Legion if you want to.
Okay.
I will also let you know that he's also the counterplay to that because it'll turn off the storm by making it different location. So
Oh. Oh. Right. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know how relevant that would be, but I mean
yeah,
I,
I
mean,
obviously can't answer that question. So
yeah,
please
yeah.
continue.
I mean, my initial instinct is that it's like too random, but maybe there's something you can build around it with Storm specifically, or if there's some other location card. But I mean, the stat line is bad, or at least underwhelming, and I guess like on turn 6, I could definitely see it being game winning. I just don't know as a card in terms of like win rate or whatever. I feel like it would be too hard to make it consistent. So I'm gonna say like inconsistent slash not great.
So Legion's actually like a very interesting card to me personally because I tend to think he's a little bit overrated. Actually, a lot of people think he's like one of the best cards in the game. He's very very good, and I think that mostly because when he came out, I think the meta was a lot more sympathetic to him than previous. So the kind of decks that Legion goes in are mid-range decks that put a lot of power on the board with their cheap cards and want to reduce RNG in the game.
Mm.
That's what his fundamental thing that he does is. So like when he came out, there was a deck that was built around going like, Brood and Absorbing Man, just putting a bunch of power on the board early. And then you had like an empty turn 5 and using like Legion to like scam a win by like filling your opponent's board up with squirrels or whatever it is like, it was a very good play then. That said, ever since then, I sort of think of him as a bellwether for how healthy the metagame is, which is to say, if there's a mid-range deck that can play Legion, the metagame is pretty healthy. And if there's if there's no ability to play Legion anymore, and there's just like no way for like this card to exist in the metagame, because he is pretty good. He's like a better, bigger Scarlet Witch that you have a lot more control over. So like if there's a bad location, you can get rid of it. Yes, that bar with no name play is a thing that you can do. Yes, you can do the storm thing. Yes, he can get rid of your opponents doing the storm thing. Like there's a lot of it, but like he tends to cycle with two things. One is, are there decks that use their cheap scaling cards to as their major threats and thus can afford playing a relatively mediocre 5? That's the number one thing that he goes with. The number two is, how prevalent are your opponent's lane scams in the game? So like the more storm there is, the better he is. The more magic there is, the better he is, because he'll turn that off too, right? And so that to me is what I think of when I think of a healthy metagame, is that there are decks that can afford playing Legion. We have not had many decks that can afford playing Legion recently. A lot of power output in the current metagame has made Legion like a fine, but you're right about the stat line, underwhelming card. So I think he's exactly where he should be, but the metagame is a lot more hostile to him than it was when he was released. And for the record, he released at a 5-8.
Okay. Wow. All right, I get it. The I I have to be honest. I heard what you said about the magic thing, and I was thinking about that when I was evaluating it, and in my head, I totally ignored the possibility that you do that against your opponent's magic.
Correct.
I
Yes.
was
That's
like,
what everyone
"Oh,
missed when this came
you
out.
can do it on your side and then
Yeah.
make it all that so it's nothing," which probably doesn't make as much sense.
No, he's much
Um,
more of a hater than
mhm,
he is a helper. Like your opponent
okay.
is trying to do stuff with locations. No, they're not. They're not trying to do that at all. They never did anything there. It's actually all gone. I turned them all into Xandar or whatever. Like that's the role he tends to take. Like when location changing is prevalent, he's like, actually, your whole game plan doesn't work.
Right.
And those are the situations where he tends to be very good. He's also a card that I think gets better the better at the game you are. The more able you are to see, like, oh, I need to set up into a Legion, the better he is. He's also a card that pairs pretty well with, like, Luke Cage, weirdly. He pairs well with, like, cards that accidentally mitigate the downside of locations. Like, I yesterday lost to a randomly generated Luke Cage into Legion copying a location that gave negative power to all my stuff and not their stuff from Luke Cage. It's like, that sounds like a weird thing, but like sometimes you just get free wins out of stuff like that, and that does matter. Like, he's a card that has free wins stapled to him some of the
Right.
time.
Okay.
And that's just usually a good thing to have. This is Snowguard. I saved some of the more complex ones for the later ones, so you have like a better idea of what's going on. Snowguard's a little more complex because she's actually 3 cards. On reveal, add the Hawk and Bear Auroras to your hand. The Hawk ignores all location abilities until the end of the next turn. The Bear triggers the effect of a location. The Hawk is a 3/3, the Bear is a 3/4.
Okay. Huh. Well, so it's a lot of cards in one. Um, first off, so it's like it gives you some value, but then can you also like scroll to the other ones again? I might
Sure.
need to.
The Hawk, 3/3.
Yeah.
On reveal, ignore all location abilities until the end of the next turn. And the Bear, 3/4, trigger the effect of this location.
Okay. So the ignoring the location one, it said or until the end of the game. So it's like if you do that on turn 6.
Yes, you turn off Limbo. But you don't turn off, like, you don't turn off stuff like the Nexus. Those turn back on at the end of the game. Like, you know, or you don't know what these locations are.
I
If you're
don't.
talking about like any location that affects the power of your units will turn back on at the end of the game.
Okay, so like bar with no name.
Will turn back on. It will not
Okay.
turn off Bar with No Name until, like, there's like a sort of, one of the things we learned from Snowguard actually is like the way the game works is there's like a scoring phase the after the game where like her effect is no longer happening and it's looking at like everything as it is. So like locations will turn on at the end of the game. She will turn off Limbo. And but otherwise locations with static effects will turn on at the end of the game.
Can you remind me what limbo is?
That's the magic location. The
Oh,
turn 7
right.
location.
Okay.
That's the only location she actually like impacts because of the way it works, right? Because it can't turn on after turn 6 has already ended, which is when it would turn on again. It can't add a turn on again. So it
Right.
just stays off. But like everything else, like the location that adds 1 power to all your units, it'll turn back on when the scoring happens. So you
Okay.
can't, she's not a permanent solution to any of this.
Got it. Okay. So then, I mean, a lot of the strength of this card would, I mean, it has to depend on like what locations are in the game. Now, it's been a while. I don't really remember the locations super well,
Good.
so I'm trying to think of like stuff where it would be useful. Now, I do know that like tampering with locations or whatever, like interacting with them seems to have been pretty strong. I mean, Legion, you said, was a strong card, at least at one point, and I know like Scarlet Witch, which like obviously changes it, but I feel like just being able to interact with locations because they are such a big part of the game seems relevant. Can you scroll to the last one more time?
The bear?
The bear? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this one, to trigger the effect of it, I mean, I'm trying to remember about like ones that have effects. It's pretty hard without like thinking about.
There's like locations that like add a 3 cost card to your hand or make you
Right.
discard a card or things like that. It'll
Mhm.
do those. That's pretty much it. I just realized like it won't do anything where like there's a specific turn where that thing happens though.
Mhm.
So like if you have a location that's like, on turn 5 all of the cards cost 1 more, you can't re-trigger that on turn 5 and make it happen on turn 6. It happens on
Okay.
the turn that it happens. So that's how this guy works.
Okay. Well, there's so much going on with this card, and it looks super cool. So it's like I want to say that it's good, but
You're judging it based on the art?
I want to believe that it's good because the art is so cool. But I'm I'm not sure about like how consistently the hawk and the bear will actually do enough. But again, I know that the location stuff is strong. The other thing that kind of immediately comes to mind is maybe like hand size stuff. I don't know how many different decks would be like that, but we talked about the Loki one earlier and how like you want to keep your hand size high. So I feel like this in like a Loki deck is just one card, two power, and then you refill your hand with one extra card. So that I feel like would be a pretty good use of it. Like maybe that's the best use of the card, and you don't even use the hawk or the bear. So I'm gonna say that it's maybe not like a staple in a lot of decks. Well, maybe it is a staple, but I'll say at least it's definitely good in the right build. I'll say it's a solid card.
Dude, you cooked. You cooked. Yeah, this is a Loki staple.
Okay.
This is a Loki staple. It's very rarely played when there isn't payoff for either hand size like Devil Dinosaur or Loki, right? Like it is very rarely played outside of that context. But yes, this is an absolute Loki staple. It's one of the best cards in the deck. Yes, there are very few cards in Marvel Snap that let you go +2 cards and or +1 card on playing them. Like even like
Mhm.
stuff like Sentinel is even unless you play the second one. Most cards do not add multiple cards to your hand. Snow Guard does at a very low cost, and those cards can be useful. Like it's not like the Hawk and the Bear are the main selling points of this card. She's pretty strong, even if she just added nothing to your hand in a Loki deck. Like if she just added like 2 cards that were cards, you'd still probably play her in Loki. She'd be a lot worse, but you'd do it. But
Mhm.
they're fine cards to play. Like you can usually find something to do with them a decent amount of the time. It's not like your favorite thing to do, but like some games you just need a card to play on some of those turns. And yeah, this is a card that is good in specific, not necessarily overly good outside of that, but extremely powerful in the right spot.
Nice. All right.
This is Nico Minoru, and there's going to be a lot of reading here. So
Okay.
Nico Minoru actually has 6 on reveal. The way they flavored it is after you play your next card, cast a spell. What happens is her text changes every turn to a new one of those on reveal effects.
Okay.
So the first one is after you play your next card, double this card's power. And at this point, I feel the need to clarify every one of these effects, it occurs randomly. Like it's not like a set order, like Nico on 6 isn't always going to be the same thing. It's randomly, but once you roll one, it's removed from the pool.
Okay.
So it doubles its own power, so it becomes a 1/4. After you play your next card, add a copy of it to your hand. After you play your next card, replace that card's location. After you play your next card, give it +2 power. After you play your next card, move it 1 location to the right. After you play your next card, destroy it and draw 2 cards. And after you play your next card, it becomes a demon. You might not know what this means. It turns into a 1/6 with no ability.
Okay.
So those are the
All right.
6 things that she does.
Okay. Interesting. So you don't you don't know what it is when you play it, right?
You
Like,
do know what it is. Her text changes to reflect the spell that she's going to cast.
oh, okay. Okay, well, that definitely makes it better than I would have initially thought because you have more. I feel like you need to have some amount of control over it because individually, I'd say most of the spells seem very good. It's just there's some like destroying the next card, like that seems a bit sketchy if you don't have control over it. But if you do, what you do, then
Correct.
after you play your next card, okay.
Do you want me to go through them
So
again?
no, no, I think I got most of them. Like extra power. I mean, the location one seemed interesting. I mean, this seems like it has a lot of it like it seems quite flexible. But so when it's okay, so when it's in your hand, you get to see the spell.
Yes, you get to see what it would be if you played it that turn, and then next
Okay.
turn it changes.
I feel like there's so much flexibility there, and like being able to see that, like the effects are powerful. Now, I guess again, where maybe it gets a little weird is they are very different effects. So some of them are just fine stats, but then some of them are like, game changing in terms of like destroying a card or whatever. But I think that the effects seem strong enough. And because you have the control over it, I mean, like, even if you get it as like a 1/4, that seems solid. I want to say the card is really good. I mean, it's there's so much going on in it, but I feel like some of the effects are potentially game winning on their own, like the location one. Um, I mean, if you make something into a demon, if you have something cheap, I don't know if you just put this in like random decks or whatever, and it's just good enough as a card. But I feel like I could maybe see that being the case. Um, so I'm gonna say that it's good.
It is very good. This I feel like you could just use the shorthand of there's so much text on here. That said, the ones that make it the best are destroy and draw two. Drawing two in Marvel Snap is super busted. Like, this is the only card in the entire game that lets you draw two cards. The only one.
Wow.
Like, drawing two cards out of your deck is super busted. Even drawing one card tends to be pretty heavily gated in a game with 12 card decks. So this is what makes it a staple in like destroy decks, for example, where like you get this basically for free because you have cards that want to die, and then you just get to like free draw two cards. It's one of the best ones. You're correct also about the demon. The demon is just like it makes for like, oh, that's a 1, 6 or something like that. And you're also, I think one of the things you noticed that I enjoyed a lot was, she gets to be like a 1/4 with this ability, and also with this ability, and you're like, oh, a 1/4, that's like pretty good when it doesn't say lose the game on it. Like it's
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, it is. That is basically. I think she's not. I think we're in like potentially like what I would describe as like when I said Legion came out and the meta was very kind to him, and so everyone thought he was this amazing card when actually he's like pretty good, like a mid range bellwether kind of guy, right? Like everyone was like this is one of the best cards in the game because at the time he was because the meta was so full of decks that actually work with him, right? And this is this case for Nico right now. Right now, we're in a meta where the meta is just full of decks that love what she's doing. That's not a guarantee to continue happening. But right now, we're in a metagame where she is at her, I would say, her apex in terms of broad playability. That might not always be the case. But this is always going to be playable in a Destroy deck. It's always going to be good there. It's likely to always be playable in Thanos whenever Thanos actually exists, which, spoiler alert, we're going to ask you about Thanos. He got changed a little bit. And he's also like she's also just like very good in a lot of these bounce shells because repeating her abilities. Her abilities tend to be very strong when you can pick them out. Repeating them is quite good.
Right. Okay. Cool. That's a cool card. A lot going on.
She is one of the newest, and it is very funny that if you just use the heuristic of lot of text equals good, you would end up with the correct answer. Mentioned I'd be asking you about that. Now, you remember this card. You played when this card was out. You know how it works. It shuffles the stones into your deck.
Mhm.
Do you remember what the stones do, or do you want me to go through it?
I probably better to go through them.
Okay. I will go through them, and then I will maybe I won't point out the change. We'll see.
Okay.
Space Stone lets you move one card to where Space Stone is and draw a card. Reality Stone, Scarlet Witch, and draw a card. Time Stone, draw a card and add one energy on the next turn. Mind Stone draws two stones. Power Stone adds 10 power to Thanos if you played all 6 of the stones and has 3 power instead of normal 1. And Soul Stone, enemy cards here have -1 power. Now, the main things that may have changed about this card, since you remember it. Space Stone used to send a card from its location to somewhere else. And, of course, this is probably the big nerf, if we're going to be real about it. Soul Stone used to draw a card, too.
Ah, yeah, I didn't even notice that. Okay, yeah.
So those are the changes that have happened to Thanos since you've last seen him. Do you think Thanos still powerful.
Um, well, so already just this part alone, like removing the draw from one of the stones is kind of a big deal because like you need to be cycling them in general, right? And if I mean, you talked about how like card draw is super valuable in Snap, and if you end up drawing into that stone, like sure the text on it is nice, but I feel like missing a card draw is a pretty big deal. So already that seems quite a bit worse. Um, could you go to the space stone again, real quick?
Yeah. Now it's a cloak effect. The card cloak.
Right, to this location. Yeah, I mean, I could still see some use for that, but uh, it's not like you can't like you can't move it to like a location that's out of reach if there's something like stopping you from putting stuff there, which seems worse. So I don't know. I mean, at the time that I played, like it was definitely a thing, and I think Thanos decks were good for a while. I think they're probably still good when I last played, I think. But the nerfs do seem fairly significant, and I would have to imagine, like especially having seen the other cards that we've looked at, it seems like the power level would have gone up a decent bit. So I feel like I would say that Thanos is maybe a bit below the power curve now, especially with losing the draw as well. It seems like a big deal. So I'll say he's not very good right now.
That's correct. He's not very good right now. And interestingly enough, the reason is mostly due to one of the cards you already saw. So the way Thanos decks tend to be built is you go like, here's my stones on the first 3 turns. You accelerate using Time Stone or something else into a 5-drop on 4, a 5-drop on 5, and then like a 6-drop on 6. It's like that's how Thanos decks tend to play out, right?
Mhm.
And when you have a game plan like that, and your opponent plays the card Loki, and then they do your end game better than you,
Ooh.
they don't even get the stones. They just get all your beef. Because Thanos shuffles at the start of the game, so it doesn't take from the starting deck. So the cards you get out of a Thanos deck when you play Loki are just all high octane bangers. It's all the cards Thanos is going to use to end the game against you. But you, instead of playing stones, were playing good cards. And so then you end up having the same end game, except the Loki player does it cheaper and also has a better board. And you end up in this very awkward spot where Thanos ends up like just eating a ton of crap to Loki. It has been good recently because there was a card that was able to keep Loki in check in a relative sense, where like make it so that matchup wasn't so bad, but that card got changed, and now the matchup actually got worse than it was before that card came out. Like it's very, very, very bad. If that matchup didn't exist, I would say Thanos would be good again. So I do want to say that this is probably not a power level concern with Thanos. It's a very specific matchup problem because the best decks in the metagame now are either decks that are going to put rocks in your deck and brick your draws and then play a Darkhawk that scales with your giant Thanos deck, or decks that are going to play Loki, right? Like those are like two very common matchups that you're going to see as Thanos. Neither of them are things that you want to see ever. It's a bad, bad, bad meta for him, but I don't necessarily think that that is a permanent state of affairs and that he's like permanently terrible. It's just very, very bad that his 2 worst matchups are. I don't know if I could say like probably the most common things you'd see in the game, but I would be like, if I were making a deck, those would be the first 2 things I'd be like, how do I match up into this? And for Thanos, the answer is just really, really badly. Really
Okay.
badly.
So he's just getting gate capped by a couple cards mostly.
Yeah. Like he was playable, I would say, like less than a month ago. But they got rid of the card that allowed him to like compete in those matchups.
Hmm.
And it got real bad real fast. This is Black Widow. You probably remember her. He is a 2/1 that adds a Widow's Bite to your opponent's hand, and the only change that she has received is that now the Widow's Bite instead. What? And the only change that she's received is that now the Widow's Bite. Why can't I click this? What the hell is happening? There we go. And the only change that she has received is that now the Widow's Bite, instead of being 0 power, is -1 power.
Ooh. Okay, so huh. Okay, so obviously 2 for 1, not great, but I mean, they have to play this. Like you can't keep this in your hand.
Yeah.
You need to draw cards in the card game. So this is effectively, I mean, the way that I'm reading is like, I mean, it's basically like a 2/2 in some senses, and you take one of their location spots and you stop them from drawing a card on the turn you play it, which seems pretty strong. Like, in terms of card advantage, that seems relevant. Now, I think when I played, this might have been because I'm playing at noob ranks or whatever, but I
Hmm.
don't think this card was super popular. I saw it a
That
little
was
bit.
not because you were playing in new ranks. That
Okay,
was exactly correct.
got it. So the question is like, is -1 power enough to be relevant? And I mean, technically, it's I mean, it's sort of like doubling the power of the card, uh, which I think can definitely matter. I mean, there's these like minor changes. I feel like people often underestimate, specifically from like a Hearthstone perspective. People will look at small stat changes and they'll think it's not relevant, and it usually is.
You're telling me
Um,
that I made this 1/5 a 1/3 and it sucks now?
Exactly, yeah. Now, this is maybe not as big of a change in terms of stats as just -1, but I mean, it still seems relevant. And I mean, the -1 card thing definitely seems nice. It's maybe just fill this in to like fill the curve. It maybe doesn't seem like a super standout card to me, but it seems like a solid two drop. And maybe it's, I know you said like Jeff is like the one that you kind of like put in every deck, but maybe this is one that if you just need to fill the curve a bit, you could throw this in as an alternative. So I'll say that this has some use, and I'll say it's an okay slash solid card now.
Correct. Yeah, you're right. People underestimated just how much that extra point of power really matters, right? Like
Mhm.
it's a much better card than it used to be. It gets played in various decks with the card Darkhawk that gets bigger the more cards are in your opponent's deck. So obviously this effectively gives +2 power to the Darkhawk. Now it ends up being like, even bigger in that sense. It gets played in decks especially though that can bounce it and replay it because stealing 2 draws from your opponent is like that's when it starts to get backbreaking. Like this is an effect that like on its own it's like okay that's annoying, but I can still play the game. The more draws you steal, the more backbreaking it gets, and
Mhm.
that is sort of the major thing that this card tends to do. I'm actually higher on her than I think most people are. I think she's very good, but I will say this is definitely a meta that sort of pushes us towards playing her as opposed to other things.
Okay. Is there like a deck where you could bounce her like 2 or more times or not really?
Yeah, you just play her like the curve that I'm thinking of specifically. Like, there's a deck where you can play like Korg, which puts a rock in your opponent's deck, and you play Black Widow, which does this, and then you play Beast, send them both back to your hand, and play them again. And it's just like that is bricking like 2.5 draws on average. Like they're just not drawing 2.5 cards, and like that is very strong. Last one. This is Galactus. He's very different from what you remember. I believe you should remember him as a 6/2 that just says if this is your only card here, destroy all other locations. He's
Yeah.
not that anymore.
Okay. I remember him as a 6/3, but
Oh yeah, he was a 6/3. Oh,
uh,
there's actually a really funny story there. He came out as a 6/3 and they made him a 6/2 in an attempt to nerf him. That
that's
didn't
hilarious.
actually do anything except make him better. Because the win condition against Galactus decks was that they would have priority and they would play their giant null and you would Shang-Chi it, right? And so the
Right.
6/2 made them less likely to have priority. And so they buffed it when trying to nerf it.
That's
And,
pretty funny.
and eventually they were like, all right, no, screw this. We have to just like make it easier to deal with this guy. Uh and they did. I think they made it by any definition easier to deal with him in the sense that now you don't have to run the specific counter cards for Galactus. You could just
Mhm.
be ahead, and then he will not be able to do his thing. It makes him a lot more. Like I think the main problem with old Galactus was you had to run specific cards or he would do his thing. And now you don't have to run specific cards. You at least get to feel like you had a choice in the game. Like, oh, I didn't reinforce that location. I opened myself up to that Galactus. It's different, right? So now he's a 6/5 on reveal. If you're winning this location, and this is your only card here, destroy all other locations. So you have to be winning when you play him.
Right. Okay. So you have to be winning, which, I mean, that's a big change because presumably the goal is like you ramp into it with whatever like extra energy card like electro or um I don't remember, there was some other like ramp cards, but if you have to be winning, like presumably those cards also have not so great stat lines, so you're less likely to be winning certain locations. And it has to be your only card. So like if you play this and then your opponent plays a, their 5 mana or 6 mana card in the same location, it's probably going to outstat this. So I guess you also have to have. Wait, okay. So if you play this, but you have priority on the same turn that they play a card, then the effect does activate.
The effect does activate, yes.
Right. Okay. But the only problem with that is like it seems kind of weird because to have priority in that sense, you have to be winning the other locations, or at least like
Correct.
one of them.
Two
So
out
it
of
just seems kind of like counterintuitive. Uh, I mean, I feel like there's got to be some way to like where you have to really build around it, but I don't really see it with this card. It just seems awkward to set up. I mean, maybe you can have those same win conditions, but I think that it's bad now. It just seems too hard to make it work.
That's correct. There are, of course, a special cadre of like dedicated Galactus sickos who still play this card. They're pretty rare, but I know they exist. Shout out to you for sticking with it, the diehards. But that is the state this card is in right now. It was recently good with a couple of recently released cards. It was a 6/7 with this effect, and they were like, all right, let's tone it down a little bit more. I think they're a little bit harsher on Galactus than they are on other cards because he's just so warping and dangerous, and when he's good, it just feels so much worse to play the game Marvel Snap, I think, because it doesn't really feel like you're playing the game Marvel Snap. He turns the game into just like, do you have it? Which there is a degree to which, every card game can be reduced to that, but I think he strips away more of the artifice around the card game, as it were, than most cards, and I think that's like a card you do have to keep in check pretty strenuously. So yeah, he's been changed actually, I think, as much as Kitty Pryde. He was released as a 6/3, he went to a 6/2, he went to a 6/7 with this effect, and then he is currently a 6/5 with this effect. And like Kitty Pryde, pretty much only the diehards are still playing the card. Although I will say Galactus is likely a little bit worse. It's probably not by much. This is a card that they very much have to keep an eye on. And I do want to give you a special shout out here. I think you earned like legitimately extra points for identifying the priority stuff, because Galactus is kind of like built for that, right? Like if you can get him to go off with priority, you can still get your effect and then just say my final card is going to outscale your final card, things along those lines, right? Like, but yes, it is very hard to get that priority when you're spending your turn 3 playing like an Electro or whatever. It's quite difficult to do. I do think that he can exist. I think he's basically in a reasonable spot from my perspective as someone who does not want him to be like, 5 to 10% of the metagame. It's kind of where I want the guy to exist. I want the diehards to be able to still play him, and then have him not be a profitable choice for anyone who's seriously tryharding. And that's pretty much where he is right now.
Yeah, no, that seems like a very sensible spot because even for me, I mean, I wasn't super engaged with Snap when I played, but I would still see people complaining about this card frequently. Like I would join a Twitch stream and the first thing I would see is like, when are they nerfing Galactus? So yeah, well, I guess it's a good thing they did that.
Absolutely. So that's all of the questions I have for you. I usually like to wrap up by asking a couple of questions like about you personally, though. So you played Snap for a little bit. Why did you stop playing? And what would cause you to start playing again?
Sure. I mean, for me, it wasn't even necessarily that I stopped enjoying the game as much. It was just kind of it was hard to keep up. And I mean, for me specifically, it's just I started dedicating more time to Hearthstone and streaming and all
Right.
that. But in terms of the actual game, I mean, I did still enjoy it. It just it felt like it was hard to keep up with all the decks and stuff. I know there's been complaints about like monetization. I don't know if that's changed since I last played, but it definitely was a bit of an issue where I was like, okay, it's too much. I'm out. I just stopped playing one day and I just never picked it back up.
See, that's sort of the thing I feel like Snap does, right? It's like while you're playing, it's like you're going, but you put it down and then you come back and you're like, oh man, it takes so much for me to catch up now.
Mhm.
Like it's one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of like this game. It's like how do they help players who want to come back to the game? McBanterface, shout yourself out.
Yep. I'm McBanterface. I stream on Twitch daily. I play Hearthstone, so some other card game stuff if you're into that. My Twitch is just at McBanterface. Same thing on Twitter. All that fun stuff. Thanks for having
Mhm.
me. This was fun. I like this.
I'm glad. People always say it was fun, and I'm
Yeah.
always like, really? Like, are you sure? I
I
hope
I
it was.
after the start, I was nervous I was going to get every card wrong, but it gets better. You know, it was a build up, and I feel like I
Right.
started to get it as we proceeded.
Well, like that's almost sort of intentional, right? Like sometimes when I build these, I put traps in them, like a card that's like meant to trick you with the card that it's next to. Like one of these cards is good, one of these is bad. They do similar things. You have to figure out which. I didn't put any traps in here. So normally that's how it goes, right? Like people sort of scale up in their understanding of the game because of the way I do my explanations. They end up, getting it more later.
So you're saying I'm not special?
You're a special boy.
Thank you. Thank you.